A look at childhood agency through Jimmy Neutron. Let me start off by explaining to you what is childhood agency. Many current preconceived notions about childhood believe that children express little to no agency, that they do not have the ability to think for themselves, act for themselves, speak for themselves, or create their own culture. Many see children as helpless beings who rely on the adults around them to keep them afloat. The truth is, children are actually very capable and express agency in many ways. In fact, in the article Accounting for Agency by Kylie Valentine, she states, childhood studies argues that children demonstrate their agency through competence, strategy, and awareness, and that their agency entitles them to greater participation and more rights. This is not to be confused with autonomy, however. As stated by Richard Flynn in his article, What Are We Talking About When We Talk About Agency?, he mentions this fact, claiming that although children exercise agency, this does not mean that they are not incredibly influenced by adults. Children do have a clear capability to express agency, but we must remember that they are still children, and therefore they are still learning how the world works. This means, as stated by Valentine, that children are constrained by their developmental maturity. As children are still learning to take in the world and utilize their agency, their practice of it is imperfect, and they must learn to use it properly. Children are, in fact, very active in expressing agency. However, their methods can be quite immature, like many other things they do. They are, after all, still young and learning to process and participate in the world. The TV show, The Adventures of Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius, is a great example of this argument. The show tells the stories of the main character, Jimmy Neutron, in his day-to-day life as an elementary-aged genius. With his big head, Jimmy creates different scientific gadgets to solve his problems, but they often result in unforeseen consequences. Like many adults in the real world, the adults in his life, even his own parents, are consistently curbing his agency, as they do not believe in his genius or capability as an agent. The very first scene we see in the pilot episode is Jimmy eagerly trying to show his parents his new invention, a futuristic juicer he calls the JuiceBot 3000. Jimmy's mother immediately doubts her child's ability, exclaiming, "Oh Jimmy, maybe you should get your father to help you." This is a clear indication that his mother does not believe he has the ability to exercise agency in the form of his inventions, and assumes he requires adult assistance in order to be successful. In fact, his parents are entirely oblivious to the existence of his science lair he created in his family shed. Not to mention, Jimmy has a sentient pet robot dog, which he built himself, which also, when necessary, doubles as a sort of Swiss Army knife. His parents see it as a casual toy, rather than a work of genius created by their child. In this way, they curb his agency just as many adults do in the real world. His expression of agency is seemingly ignored, as there could be no way that a child is capable of such things. But the truth is, it is very possible, as we see from all of the things Jimmy accomplishes. From inventing his own jetpack, to making himself a robot little brother, and even a time machine, Jimmy can do it all. Yet, no matter what crazy stunt Jimmy pulls, it is unrecognized by his parents. To them, he is just a child, and his parents certainly treat him as such. In their minds, there is no way their child could pull such things. Not to mention, they aren't all that bright themselves. But, just because his parents are unable to recognize it, does not mean that Jimmy's agency is not there. From the viewer's perspective, his agency is clearly expressed, but to his parents, he is just a child who is incapable of such things. When focusing on just his abilities, Jimmy's agency is a perfect example which reflects arguments made by both Valentine and Flynn. Jimmy clearly exercises a great deal of agency, but his immaturity can create some problems as well. One example of this, which is seen in the show, is that in which Retroville, Jimmy's hometown, is experiencing a particularly hot day. He and his friends desperately search for a way to have fun while escaping the heat, but the neighborhood girls will not allow the boys to join them in their pool. As a quick fix to the unbearable temperatures, Jimmy decides to quantumly enhance his friend's sunblock to actually block out the sun. In doing so, Jimmy accidentally creates new ice age, making him the most hated person in town. Obviously, here Jimmy exercises a great deal of agency, as most adults are even incapable of quantumly enhancing anything, let alone a 5th grader such as Jimmy. But this method was a bit too extreme, as there could have easily been another solution that would have way less consequences, if any at all. This is where we see Jimmy's immaturity come into play. Although he is clearly a genius in the fact that he is capable of doing such a thing, he quickly turns to an extreme solution, such as blocking out the sun, without considering any of the consequences. As Valentine explains, this is due to the fact that children have an insufficiently developed sense of consequences. As well as this, it is clear that Jimmy tends to let his intelligence get to his head, and loves to perform the most complicated, often consequential experiments in order to prove himself. Perhaps this flaw is a result of the fact that his parents curb his agency and fail to recognize his achievements. He may be using showing off as a way to get this validation from others. This would explain why Jimmy is always going above and beyond when it is not necessary. I believe that this, too, could be an example of how adults may influence a child's agency, as I have previously mentioned based on claims made by both Valentine and Flynn. In this case, it would seem that Jimmy's parents' inability to recognize his agency causes him to make these bad decisions, which deem him as immature, although it truly could just be his immaturity alone. After all, the term immaturity is often used in direct relation to the behaviors of children. Yes, Jimmy may express himself as a true agent, and he is very capable. However, we must remember that he is still a child of elementary school age, and is sure to make some mistakes. This is true for most children. Although adults are prone to mistakes as well, they have had the time to practice their use of agency, and are knowingly very capable. Children, although capable in their own ways, are still practicing their use of agency, and therefore will practice it immaturely. Just as claimed by Valentine, children will eventually obtain this maturity when given the time and growth to do so. But until then, this immature status does not mean children cannot be considered agents. It simply means that they are still just kids. Despite Jimmy Neutron's ability to reflect these arguments, it can be a bit of an exaggeration. The show even goes as far to make many of the adults seem stupid in comparison to some of the child characters, likely in order to further highlight Jimmy's intelligence. However, this brief fact strays from many of the arguments made by both Valentine and Flynn. Although they agree that children have more agency than many give them credit for, they understand that the agency of adults is still superior. Specifically, Flynn discusses how adults may have some influence over children's expression of agency, as well as the fact that adults obviously have more power than children do. Valentine as well mentions the same relationship between children and adults, stating that kids are constrained by their dependence on adults. The key here is that yes, adults do have an influence which does, to an extent, limit a child's agency. This does not mean that they are incapable or completely dependent on adults. Flynn even mentions that, although adults have influence, this does not mean that children won't take what they are given by adults and create their own culture or ideas from it, or that they won't resist what is given to them. Overall, the Adventures of Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius, can tend to exaggerate the true agency of children and use the ignorance of Jimmy's parents as a tool to do so. Nonetheless, it still can be used as an example which highlights the existence of childhood agency, despite the fact that Jimmy's agency is always curbed. All in all, it is true that the Adventures of Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius, may be a slight exaggeration, but it still does provide a good example of the existence of childhood agency. Like many children in the real world, Jimmy's agency is curbed by his parents and other adults, but is still very much there. The show displays how even with the lack of adult encouragement, children's agency is driven by their own interest and curiosity. Each episode has some sort of clear depiction of a child with strong agency, while also reflecting a child's immaturity that makes their agency imperfect in relation to Valentine's claims. Jimmy's agency, like many real children, is very capable, just still adapting. The show perfectly agrees with many of the arguments made by both Richard Flynn and Kylie Valentine, and even reflects a bit of the common belief that children do not have much agency at all. It both highlights this flaw in our society, as well as proving it wrong. Jimmy's agency may always be curbed, but he is definitely an agent.